Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to Making Digital Assessment an Integral Part of Online and Blended Learning. This is a Times Higher Education webinar in partnership with Inspera. My name is Alistair Lawrence. I'm the Special Projects Editor at THE, and I'll be chairing today's discussion, for which I am delighted to be joined by a panel of experts from academia and industry, who are Devril Kapp, the Dean of Leeds Beckett Law School, Ishan Kolhatta, who is General Manager for the UK at Inspera Assessment, and Patrick Ryan, who is Joint Director of Online Learning at the Inns Court College of Advocacy. There will be an opportunity to put questions to the panel during the final 5 or 10 minutes of the hour that we have scheduled today. So please feel free to write any questions in the box in Zoom, and we will answer as many as possible before the end. To begin, I'd like to begin by noting that as teaching and learning have shifted online during the pandemic, there was an inevitable knock-on effect for assessment, with the days of hundreds of students sitting in exam halls now seemingly long gone. Digital assessment is playing an increasingly important role in the future of both online and blended learning, but this is something that creates new strategic challenges for university leaders. We've identified a number of those challenges, and we'd like to speak about them today to exchange knowledge and best practice about how to begin to solve them. So I'd like to start by asking the panel, how can the innovation and improvements enabled by digital assessment be retained as universities move towards a long-term future of blended learning? Devril, would you like to start us off, please?
Yes, of course. Well, I think, in all honesty, once the genie is out of the bottle, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to try and put it back in. So many students now have had the opportunity to use different assessment methods, and as they've experienced them, and as some academics would prefer to be attached to a piece of elastic and go back to examinations and traditional sitting in a room and writing for 3 hours, I think there's going to be a significant amount of pushback from our students who are going to say, no, we preferred it actually when we were doing online assessments, preferred it when we were sitting at home doing and answering the questions that we had to be that we were asked, and we would like to stay with that. I think my particular concern with all of this is that when March 2020 came, and that was what, 18, 19, 20 months ago, there's been an awful lot of rushing around and an awful lot of knee-jerk activities and knee-jerk reactions, because that is what was absolutely required at the time. I do feel that now there is a little bit of time just to sit, think, look, and try and work out what is best for the student experience, to make sure that moving forward, we were able to give a great student experience and a great assessment experience as well.
Have you noticed much diversification in terms of the type of digital assessment preferred by students and teachers at different levels and different courses?
Absolutely. I mean, it's been great actually from a teaching and learning and pedagogical perspective. The ability for us to be able to get some individuals to think differently and assess differently has been wondrous. It's been great, and it's actually turned out that the individual students concerned often do a lot better because the assessment strategy and the assessment methodology has been adjusted slightly. And also it's about, what we call authentic assessment or real world assessment, and it's about stepping away from 3 hours of trying to put down as much as you possibly know on a page to answer just about a question, and actually try and adapt those particular tasks to real world type problems. And we've all had to do an assessment within or we've all had to do a report possibly by 12 o'clock on Wednesday, and so let's just try and have an assessment that meets that particular requirement. But it's not something, I think, that we need to really rush to change. It's about trying to look and take a look back at how students have done, whether they've done better, talking to the students, trying to engage them and give them their student voice to ensure that we're then able to make those strides forward and keep what is good, and stay away from what actually has in certain circumstances not been so great.
Okay, thank you. Patrick, do you think there is already enough long-term planning been put in place by your institution, or is it something that's going to need to shift and change going forward when you think about digital assessment?
Thanks, Alistair. It's a really good question. And I agree completely with what Dev said about the genie not going back into the bottle. No one's going back to where they were pre-March 2020, it seems to me. We're in a kind of unique position because our institution was relatively new in the marketplace, and we were only ever due to start teaching and assessing in September of 2020. And my team and I had spent the previous 3 years preparing an online version of the bar course. So our institution just trains people who want to become barristers and be called to the bar. And so we were ready to go as far as online teaching was concerned, but online assessment was something that kind of jumped up and surprised us in the same way it surprised everybody else. And I think what we've learned, Dev was absolutely right when he said, everyone had to be very fast moving, very reactive to, almost 24 hour by 24 hours, we were having to adapt to changing situations. We thought we were going to get away with face-to-face assessments in July and August, and then the pandemic, if we remember back to the time of the pandemic, came along and suddenly those plans were shelved and we were back to remote assessment and online assessment. With a little bit of breathing space, and I hesitate to use that phrase in the face of what everyone is dealing with and has been dealing with in the last 7 to 10 days, but with a little bit of breathing space, I think things are going to unfold in this way. There are clearly some subjects and some types of assessment that lend themselves brilliantly to online assessment, and where the days of 3 hours in an exam room simply aren't going to be as to cater as well to the needs of the students and to be as effective as assessment instruments. There are other places in the kind of assessments that we do in terms of live advocacy assessments or client interviewing assessments, where actually the truth is that the remote assessment is the second best option. It's still great to have, and it will be great in an emergency and in particular circumstances to be able to fall back on. But I think the thinking that's going to go on over the next few months, certainly at our place, is going to be what works as an online assessment, what is better as an online assessment, and where do we need to think about online assessment being our second preferred option, and the option that allows us to continue to run an assessment where a student might not be able to attend an exam centre in particular circumstances, be they COVID related, or in the future be they un-COVID related, if that makes sense.
Thank you. And to the point about what works online and what works in terms of prioritising the modes of assessment, there's been a criticism in previous months of what's been nicknamed sort of lift and shift, where you really just take something that you used to do in person and try your best to kind of panel beat it for online so that it can be delivered in the same way. Obviously, with disciplines such as law, you're now dealing with things like PSRB requirements and other institutions and other stakeholders who need to be satisfied when you fundamentally change the mode of assessment. Do you think where's the change going to come from? Is it going to be institution-led? Does it need to be policy-led? Is there a way to innovate while other people stand still?
Alice, would you like me to pick that up?
Yes, Patrick.
Yeah,
yes.
Of course. So I start from the point of view of having come fresh to online learning. Let's start with the learning, because the assessment follows on from the learning. One of the things that we learned in 2018, 2019, writing an online course to teach litigation, which are essentially knowledge-based skills, was that there's no point in trying to take a tried and tested face-to-face course and shove it online and hope that everything works. There's no point in just recording hour after hour of lecture and shoving it online. There's no point in taking the 5 questions you ask in a seminar and then shoving them online and hoping the students read about them and talk about them. You change the method of delivery and you change the curriculum and the way you teach based on the method of delivery. And I think the same has to be true for assessments. I think we have to be in a world now where we look at what we're assessing and work out the best method of doing that. And we do that from a point of view of not only of the content of what we're assessing, but also in terms of the access that students have. What is the method of assessment that in this particular subject, in this particular module, in this particular course, offers the student the best opportunity to give the best account of themselves under assessment conditions? And for some subjects, the answer might continue to be that requires a sit-down exam, pen and paper in an exam hall with everybody else. Please don't misunderstand my position as being everything now has to go online and nothing goes back to the way it was. But I think if we are honest with ourselves, there are better ways of assessing in certain areas than we have been used to previously. And what the what the pandemic has done in this, as in so many other areas, is cause us to speed up our thinking about these things. So whereas previously we could get away with another year of examples, and let's think about online assessment in a couple of years' time when it's a bit better developed, we've all had to just do it in the same way we had to move to remote teaching overnight when we didn't necessarily know how that would work. So the question now is, what have we learned? What works better for the students, for the assessors, for the award, as far as the mechanism of assessment is concerned? Where that's online and digital, why would we go back? Where it's not online and digital, of course, the best method of assessment will be a different method. Does that make sense, Alistair?
Yes, no, that's great. Thank you very much. Dev, please.
Yeah, if I could just come in on that, because I've seen that there's a question that's popped up on the Q&A bar, which is talking about one particular institution which is now going back to proper exams, I guess, is really what the individual's trying to say, is that sometimes there are times when we do need exams, and Patrick's absolutely right, but those particular times we need to think about whether it is actually required. So for example, for the bar course that Patrick is involved with, there are certain examinations that take place because one would expect a barrister, when they're in practice, to have certain levels of knowledge at their fingertips, and that needs to be with them, and it needs to be with them all the time. And on those sorts of, and the same thing for medicine as well, there would be certain times when you would expect a doctor to know precisely what it is that they have to do in that split second without having to go off and say, right, I'm just going to go and check something. In those instances, yes, an examination is absolutely right, and it's a proper, sensible assessment method. But I do feel that sometimes there is that sort of, as I say, the piece of elastic that takes us back to maybe the way that we were assessed many years ago. And I think sometimes that isn't necessarily the best way to do it, because it's not necessarily reflective of what goes on in the real world. Again, examinations, they bring benefits because there is limited opportunity for plagiarism, limited opportunity for collusion, academic irregularity sort of disappears off. It's much lower risk. There's no chance really of a contract cheating instance either. But I do feel that we just need to be a little bit more sensitive about keeping what is good, not throw the baby out with the bathwater and just get rid of everything that was good as well as what was bad, and just think sensibly. An assessment should be about reducing an assessment to the irreducible minimum of what you need to do to really test those learning outcomes. And it gives us an opportunity, the pandemic and moving on, to really think carefully about how we assess students moving into the future.
Great, thank you very much, Deborah. Ishan, I'd like to bring you in at this point, please. Just if you can tell us a little bit about your work at Inspera and also how this dovetails with the points that Deborah and Patrick have made.
Yeah, sure. So I have the experience of when the pandemic hit back in March 2020, doing the pandemic pivot that everyone else did, because I was at a university and I was trying to work out how we would do assessments digitally. Pandemic pivot is a phrase I picked up from a professor in Oklahoma yesterday. I still think it sounds more like a Mo Salah move, but I'll use it because I like it. So I was involved in that, and then I moved to Inspera about a year ago. And I think without obviously wanting, the downside of going third in anything is that you end up sounding like the leaders debate from 2010. And I agree with Nick or Dev and Patrick in this case. And I do, but I actually want to reference to one of the questions that's been asked in the Q&A box by Sahar about digital assessments and online assessments being used interchangeably. And I think that's partly it. I was first involved in what I'm going to term digital assessments about 4 years ago. And I was at an institution that was one of few who was moving towards digital assessment. And I had this idea that I would get it done across the institution by September 2020. I did, but COVID was part of the reason that we got there in the time frame required. But that's because we need to look at them as two different things. Digital assessment is a student taking an assessment on a computer, be it theirs or one belonging to your institution. Online is a subset of that. Online is them being online and remote from you. So while I agree absolutely with the points that have been made by Dev and Patrick, that summarizing those, that one ought to keep what's good, reject what hasn't particularly worked, I don't think it's as narrow as thinking, do we have to be online or do we have to have pen and paper? Actually, there's gradations there. There is is this better digitally or is it better on pen and paper? And using a computer and versus using pen and paper. Because even though Inspera is a digital assessment company, we have a paper-based option for the types of questions that lend themselves better to people writing, and you then scan them back in and they go back into the digital system. Once you've made that decision, if the answer is digital and it's simple because it's them typing, that's fine. If it's pen and paper, you may still want to think, well, actually, can they do it digitally, but without being remote or online? I think remote and online are potentially interchangeable. So there is that sort of gamut of different ideas available there. And I think that the way that you get there, which I can see both from the point of view of being in an institution and now being a vendor talking to institutions, is that the way that this works best is to have the subject matter experts, the cognate specialists, learning and teaching, learning technologists. You do need your IT teams with their infrastructure knowledge. You need those administrating the exams all together to innovate. I think the way this doesn't work is when you have little subsets or just one group driving it, because by design or accidentally, you will end up with a slightly skewed view as to what actually is best and what actually works. So it's that collaboration of people making that digital paper decision and then finally deciding, what configuration digitally or on paper for that matter would actually work best.
Great, thank you very much, Hisham. I think it's what's interesting is from what Patrick and Devil have said so far is that even amongst a relatively small sample we have on the panel, different institutions are starting from different starting points in terms of what their own digital infrastructure is. And that, along with the cultural shift, seems to be perhaps the biggest influence in terms of deciding how you evaluate what you keep online and what you don't. Patrick, would you like to add your thoughts to Ishan's?
Alistair, I wonder if it helpful just to illustrate what Ishan was saying, just to talk about an assessment that we ran last week and to describe the sort of different subsets that Ish was describing, perhaps in giving a real world example. So we had a digital assessment. All the students sat, all bar a few of the students sat at the assessment using a computer. Some of those students were on a different time frame. They were in Asia and they had an earlier start time. The majority had a 2 p.m. start time in the UK, and they were either at home or they were somewhere else where they had a secure internet connection, a reliable internet connection. We then had another subset who, because of different learning requirements, were in our building, but still on a digital connection, on an online connection, doing the exam in the same way as everybody else, but they were being live invigilated to ensure that any personal learning plans could be given effect to. And then we had a final set of students who, for a very small number, who were taking the same exam, but via pen and paper, and being invigilated again within our premises. So even within one exam, you can have those subsets of candidates that Ish was talking about. That's just a way of illustrating what Ish was talking about by way of an example.
And how easy or difficult have you found it to change the culture around assessment in order to get people to buy into that kind of delivery?
Do you mean from a student perspective or from a staff and institutional perspective?
Well, both, actually. I know.
Okay, let's take them one at a time. So for the students who started this process in doing their first exams in December 2020, there wasn't really much of a choice. It was either do it because we were in full lockdown. It was either do it online or not at all. And some of them chose not at all. Those were for reasons some of those were to do with reasons of being unfamiliar with the system. And we, of course, said to anybody in that situation, well, look, we're not going to force you into this, and we're going to make alternative provision further down the line. But most students were happy to go with the online system once they've been familiarized with it. And really, once you take one brick out the dam as far as the students are concerned, we found that really they're quite amenable to doing this. So we had another bank of assessments in the second part of our course. One of those assessments was online, really no trouble at all, no pushback from the students continuing to use the online platform once they had become familiar with it and knew what they were about. And similarly, the next generation that came after the next year, the cohort that came after that first cohort, they were reassured by the fact that it worked for the first cohort. So very little by way of pushback, by way of students. Where we have had a little bit of anxiousness is where you say to students, and I've just had to have this meeting this morning with some students who were being assessed in January, there's a chance we're going to have to change the method of delivery. Now, we wanted to give them as much notice and as much warning as possible and get them to start thinking about what that would mean. But we institutionally took the decision there's a chance we're going to have to move to remote assessment in January, or at least for some of them, for those who test positive on the morning of an exam and can't travel, for example, because they're self-isolating. So that creates a little bit of anxiety. But by and large, they're now used to this. A lot of students we're seeing this year, for example, have come through with the knowledge that they were doing online assessments in their final year at university. So this is not a new phenomenon for them anymore. From the staff point of view, again, I think we had to go with it in because we were forced into those circumstances. But once you get the staff involved, once they've done it once they've done it twice and seen that it's worked, again, there's less pushback. And because of the type of exams we run anyway, they kind of they're amenable and susceptible to an online assessment in a way that kind of makes that work for us. So it's a little bit harder with the staff than it is with the students, but everyone gets there.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. We were going to leave questions till the end, but it's great. There's more than 200 people joining us today. So firstly, thank you all very much for showing up this close to Christmas. And secondly, there's been a few questions that have come through in real time as the panelists have talking. Patrick, we've had a few questions about the question of equity when you are changing the mode of, or giving people options over the mode of delivery, and whether the students think that's fair or not. What was the feedback that you received from people when they were aware that there were different options in order to be assessed that way?
So that's a really interesting question, and it kind of follows from a meeting I literally came out of 2 hours ago. And one of the questions, for example, in that meeting was, well, will we be assessed on different criteria depending on whether we have a remote assessment or a face-to-face assessment? And what we were able to say to students is, look, it's not that the criteria changes, but the way that the way you are assessed is taken into account by the assessors when they're marking. So in the example that Dev and I were talking about a little bit earlier on of an advocacy assessment, where you're assessing somebody's performance to appear in court in front of a judge and make an argument. The way you do that in practice, whether you're online or whether you're face-to-face, differs slightly. It's much harder to maintain the eye contact, for example, and the communication skills are slightly different when you are appearing online as opposed when you're appearing face-to-face. And what we do is judge the skill based on the method of assessment. So if you make no eye contact at all with anybody, either face-to-face or online, you're going to be marked down for that. But we fully realize that you might make less eye contact in an online situation because it's harder to engage the person you're speaking to in eye contact because they've got more things to look at. They've got other screens, they've got papers in front of them. But if we can see you attempting to engage in that way and using your skills in communication to effectively get your point across, of course you're not marked down for that because you've got a remote experience. If the assessors can be sensitive to the mode of assessment and think through how the criteria apply and can be not changed in terms of changing the criteria, but made to fit the method of assessment, then it seems to me there is little or no disadvantage to students. And we've said that today. We will ensure in our marking processes that we ensure that we don't build in anything that disadvantages you if you've had to be a last minute change to a remote assessment. Nobody will have on their mark sheet, this didn't go very well because it didn't seem very used to online assessment. We'll mark you in the same way, we'll apply the same criteria, but with a sensitivity to the way in which the assessment is being conducted.
Great, thank you very much, Patrick. It's great to have that overview. Hopefully that's answered a few questions in the audience. Devril, I will come to you in a moment, but Ishan did have his hand raised very briefly.
Yeah,
so
just a really brief point based on something that Patrick was saying in his last couple of answers. And I think that it's back in 2020, we would have hoped that by the end of 2021, we'd have been out of COVID. We're not, and it looks like we're going to have restrictions of some sort for some period of time. But that means that a lot of the decisions that we're making at the moment are based on the real threat of COVID. So Patrick was talking about the candidate who might test positive on the morning of the exam. And that gets in the way of what then comes next, which is once we get back to a world where there's actual free choice, then what do we do? So taking some of the points in the questions, it's the idea that if we're going to give students that choice of methods of assessment, that may ameliorate some of the difficulties in terms of them being forced to do an assessment in a particular way because of circumstances. And then we can build to make sure that nobody is disadvantaged by doing it in a different way. It is genuinely a different method of doing your assessment, but the assessment criteria remain equitably applied to each candidate. That, of course, is at the moment being interrupted by forced choices. So I think, again, institutions need to look at two different things. One, the pandemic pivot, and then two, what am I going to do when I can give students the choice of doing an exam in an exam hall, either on paper, potentially with a computer, or in their pajamas at home, with them making that choice.
Great, thank you very much. Sorry, Deverell, please.
Yes, there are 2 points I'd like to make. One is about students and academics choosing new particular assessment processes. I suppose from my perspective, students themselves are a little bit nervous about using these new assessment methods too. So it's not just the academics. Students don't necessarily like proctoring, which is the remote invigilation systems, because they feel sometimes that some external force is controlling their camera, and it will always be there, and it will catch them unawares when they're perhaps not expecting it. And given that most students, or a lot of students, often do the work from bedrooms or somewhere else, they don't necessarily, they have a feeling of anxiety about that. And as unlikely as it is that it will ever cause any problems, who knows what will happen. It's about the storage of those elements of data. There is of course the academic irregularity point, which I think we probably should come back to at some point. There's digital poverty, which I think is one particular issue about ensuring that individual students themselves are on a level playing field, and that is always going to be something where we do need to give a real amount of consideration to. But the last question comes down to the choice of assessment, and this sort of takes the conversation maybe in a slightly different way. But in my institution, I've always been very keen on offering students a choice of assessment. So you may have one particular individual who would like to write a 4,000 piece of coursework, and another individual who would actually prefer to do a 15-minute presentation and then write a 1,500 piece of coursework to go alongside it. And so offering the student choice to be, as long as it meets the learning outcomes of that particular module and the course, that is not a bad thing. Is giving student choice and the ability to make their own decisions in this world isn't a bad thing. On the backside of that, though, of course, you've got the PSRB requirements, and they sometimes are very forceful, sometimes possibly a little bit archaic, and sometimes it takes the rest of the HE sector to start to move away from traditional sets of assessment to actually bring them on side.
Okay, thank you, Deverell. And I'd just like to ask all the panelists what their experience has been with dealing with PSRB bodies so far, because that's another concern that people have from the questions.
PSRBs tend to have sort of fairly fixed views at the moment as to their exams being conducted as close to the way that they were done on pen and paper as is possible. And certainly we've seen the drive from institutions to use tools like remote proctoring coming from PSRBs who insist the exams have to be done in that way. What I would say is that over the course of 2021, I've seen lots of institutions who've realized actually where they don't have PSRBs, they have lots of different levers they can pull to, as the questions have indicated, try and ameliorate or eliminate the instances of collusion or contract cheating or other ways in which students try to get around regulation. So institutions are looking at the fact that they can do things differently. If you wrote a closed book exam and you relied on people being able to recall information that they wouldn't otherwise have, if you make it digital, unless you lock the candidates down in their environment, you're going to give them a way of finding what they wouldn't otherwise be able to see. So institutions get the levers, I'm sure. PSRBs are less likely to move from what we've seen in 20 and 21. One would hope that over the course of the next couple of years, they would look at how they assess and how they insist on assessments being run to be more flexible. If they don't, and they choose not to change their exams, then students are going to be still proctored in some sort of way, whether that's a human being walking around a room or some sort of digital mechanism.
And the further to the question about proctoring and limiting contract cheating or any other forms of plagiarism, are there any particular subjects that would you say are the hardest ones to to assess in this way. I once heard from a computer science professor saying that they're perhaps the hardest candidates to proctor, because whatever operating system you put in front of them, a fair few number will have the technical expertise to bypass it in one way or another.
Yeah, there's always that possibility. And we've certainly spent a long time with our Longterm browser making sure that if you do something like try and run it on a virtual machine or run it on a VPN, it just won't work. So it's not a case of trying to make it work. It just says no, and that's it, and you're done. So yes, there will be subject areas where people are more likely to try and get around the restrictions that are put on them. But as I say, if you're outside of the PSRB remit, then either you potentially go back to paper, or you look at all the other levers that you could pull in order to change your assessment to deal with that concern. At the same time, I mean, I say this as a computer science graduate from 21 years ago, and not a very good one at that. You would also think that the area in which you would most likely want your exams to be digital were those like computer science. I still remember doing 6-8 written exams a year where I was writing code in pen and paper in an exam hall, which didn't seem particularly real either for part of my assessments. So I think it's about ensuring that you use all of those tools that exist. And really, if you are not willing to change some of your assessment methods or mechanisms or what's in your toolkit, then you are going to leave yourself with fewer options, and that might include proctoring. I don't think proctoring is for everyone, and I don't think it's for every subject by a long stretch of the imagination, but I think it is something that is potentially there. And I think that while there are plainly concerns that students and staff have, there are also some students who actually want that opportunity to do it. I know for my part, I'm not going to stand up, I promise, that I prefer wearing comfortable trousers now after all the time we've been at home. So I very often can be wearing a smart shirt, again, not today, I'm wearing a hoodie, and be wearing comfortable trousers. Now, the point of this story is not to describe my dress sense, but that I would prefer to do an exam in my house. That's me. Not every student will. And again, post-pandemic, when we can give students the choice and we're not enforcing this, then there's that chance to allow students to do things in the way that's most comfortable to them. And then for institutions to work out what the best vehicle is to make sure that there's integrity in their authentic assessments.
Great, thank you, Ishan. There's a couple of points that are related to that when we talk about equity and also giving students a variety of options so that they can play to their strengths but still be assessed in a fair and even way. Deborah, to your point about allowing different types of assessment for different students and different modes of delivery, how do you avoid workload ballooning for the tutors who are managing those courses and those assessments?
Well, I mean, we employ quite a precise, or workload allocation is always an art, not a science, but we do try and make sure that we are as fair as possible when it comes to those sorts of allocations. But that is often driven by the module leader themselves, who wants to give the students the choice of assessment. And that's not something that we would ever try and dissuade them from. It's not going to be, you can either do a complete practical assessment one side and then you can do something very, very written, because it has to try and meet the learning outcomes of that particular module. But I may just be very, very fair, but I'm as accommodating as I possibly can be. And I'm also very keen for our academics to try new things as well. Sometimes it's not just about what's shiny and bright, and building assessment strategy isn't like building a bear when you go to a department store, but it is something where you do feel that you want to, you can afford to take some small risks as long as they're managed, and with higher education sometimes we need to do that. But e-assessment itself, digital assessment, online assessment, those sorts of assessments sometimes come at a cost, and sometimes they come because they require a little bit more effort at a different part of the year. And so you may find, so for example, if you are building in a multiple choice assessment for, say, contract law, then actually writing and creating those multiple choice questions for contract law actually takes more time, but it takes more time at the start of the academic year, and then it relieves a significant amount of burden when it comes to marking, because if it's a multiple choice, it's all marked by a computer, which is great. So sometimes it's about that Chinese puzzle and a bit of the jigsaw, where you take a bit of effort here and you pop it there. But with all types of assessment, it's about trying to get the balance absolutely right. And it's not something where the students need to be disaffected too greatly, and it's certainly not something where the staff need to be disaffected too greatly either. So it's just striking that right balance, Alistair.
Great, thank you very much. Patrick, if I can come to you to flag one of the other concerns that have been raised in several questions that we had from the audience, which is how do you meaningfully address the problems created by digital poverty and access? So this is not necessarily people who don't have the requisite devices, although that is a problem for many students. It's also about having the space in which you can take an assessment on a virtual device that doesn't impact perhaps logistically in terms of it being, you need somewhere that is quiet and where you can concentrate, but also doesn't trigger any well-being concerns that people may have whose home lives have a huge amount of variation from student to student.
Sure, and it's a really important question, Alistair, and it's, again, like with so many others, one we've had to grapple with quickly, and one to which all of the answers are probably not fully fleshed out. Let me talk a little bit about how we do it at our place. We have the benefit of being a really small institution, and by really small, I mean our first cohort of students was 35 students. We're a bit bigger than that now, but we're still certainly less than 200 students. So we don't have some of the issues that the much larger institutions would have. But let me say that the approach we take is this: it doesn't have to be all or nothing. The fact that you offer digital assessment, which an online assessment which people can take at home, doesn't mean all students have to take it at home. So, for example, we offer those students who don't have a reliable internet connection or don't have somewhere quiet where they can shut themselves away for a period of time, either because they've got caring responsibilities or they don't have a accommodation or a home life that allows for that. We provide physical space for them to come and do their exam. We have a hardship fund so that those who are struggling to obtain the relevant IT equipment can make an application to a hardship fund to be able to do that. It doesn't take a huge amount to think through some of the issues that are created by those who suffer from digital poverty to come up with creative solutions that allow for them to take part in a digital assessment as in the same way that students who don't suffer from digital poverty can do so. It just requires a little bit of thinking at the front end to think, what do we do with a student who can't afford the kit or doesn't have access to the kit? What do we do with the students who don't have reliable internet? What do we do with the students who don't have a physical space in which to do the exams? And I think for most institutions, if they put their hands on their hearts and said, can we think of some solutions to those problems? I suspect, however big you are, there are solutions out there that can be found. And I think it's really important to get away from the idea of thinking, well, we've moved to digital assessment and therefore we'll never have students face-to-face in a room again doing an assessment on our campus. You might have both. You might well have students who are at home, as Ish says, in their comfy trousers and their hoodie doing their assessment because that's where they're most comfortable. But for others, you need to provide a space, and in some cases, you need to provide kit so that they can do their assessment and take part meaningfully as well.
And does the same consideration need to be extended to staff who may have their own working habits disrupted by the fact that maybe their parents or carers, or they don't have the same mobility or access levels when they're trying to do some of the practical assessments that we've talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think as Dev said, with the way you prepare a multiple choice exam, all the effort in setting a multiple choice exam goes in at the front end, setting the paper, making sure the questions are right. The marking burden is then teeny tiny because the computer does it all, and all you do at the end is check that the stats look right, and you maybe have an exam board and interrogate some things. It's a little bit like that. If you put the effort in, we found at the front end, are proactive about making sure that everybody, not just the students, but the assessors. In our case, we have, for some exams, we have actors who come in to play particular roles, thinking about how we can make it possible for them to meaningfully take part in online assessment. Making sure that, for example, they've got all the papers they need in a format they can read them. Some prefer to have the hard copy papers, some prefer to have them in a digital format so they can have an iPad next to them on the screen. It's really about thinking through those issues And to be honest, as we're finding, the more that we've done that, the fewer issues arise each time we come back to them, because we've solved some of the issues last time around. We're still getting new issues that come up from time to time that need a creative solution. But the more times you do this, the less frequently new issues arise completely. And we found that our staff are more attuned now to solving those problems for themselves because they've been through the process 2 or 3 times with some support.
Okay, thank you very much. Isha, we've had a couple of questions about the actual tools that universities can put in place in order to really get results. Are there particularly popular ways of working or dominant ways of digital assessment that you're seeing it through the Inspera platform?
Yeah, it's a mix that we're seeing from people who use it, from people who are using it as an open book assessment format. So I know what's been quite popular over the last 20 months was the original pivot of releasing a paper and then giving people a sort of 2-hour time marking to submit it. That's something that you can do within the platform by setting a 2-hour window, and the candidates can type either natively in the platform or upload a file, and then it can go through a similarity checker if that's what you want to do. We've seen that some have changed their assessment. They've looked at other mechanisms. So for example, where people were either using some MCQs or wanted to move towards those, they're using them in an open book format, but in order to, rather than use something like proctoring, they're using the randomization function or indeed the pull from function. So if you have a bank of questions that you decide are of equal difficulty, that instead of candidates all getting the same ones, they get 2 randomly out of 10. And if you think about something like a multiple choice exam in that format, if what you do is randomize the answers on screen, you randomize the order of the questions, and you pull some from a selection, what you are doing is making it certainly far more difficult for students to collaborate with one another, and very much getting to the point of, well, actually, I probably should spend my time answering the questions rather than trying to collaborate. But of course, that requires a threshold of the extent to which you can take that risk and whether you need to do something different. Equally, we've seen institutions who've gone down the route of a lockdown browser. So they've used our lockdown browser and locked candidates out of the rest of their system. That, of course, does not prevent you from having another computer or another person. So it's, again, what you're trying to eliminate. And then at the other end of the scale, yeah, we've seen institutions who've used remote proctoring. But crucially with that, it's been very much our philosophy is that if you're going to do that, you need to be really upfront with the students about what you're doing and who sees it and what they do. So with our proctoring service, it's not contracted out to other people to do. It's for you to do. It's for your university to do the reviews. So it's being clear with your students that it's your staff looking at them. We, for example, have a data retention policy, so we won't keep your data beyond the set period that is agreed, and all of the data gets flushed. And being clear what happens to that data. So we don't import pictures from anywhere else. We don't export the video that we have to either our own bucket or for use by anyone out there. It's all your data. You use it. When you're done with it, it gets deleted. And then beyond that, outside of the scope of the things we've ordinarily seen, as some of the questions have suggested, and as, for example, taking Eliza's point that she made in the questions, we've seen institutions who've moved towards a more portfolio based set of assessments, or getting students to create artifacts like websites or blogs. And to take Eliza's question in particular, how do you then ensure that you're actually seeing the version that you wanted to on deadline day? As an example of that, you can allow the student to create their blog, and then you give them a timed window within the platform to upload a version of it. And if they then want to carry on editing, they can on that live blog, but you're seeing the one in stasis at that point where you close the assessment. So yeah, we've seen, if we generalize that, we've seen some institutions who are trying to digitize their paper, and that's because that's where they are right now. And I think once they've got some breathing room, they'll keep adapting. Whereas we've seen others who said, okay, wow, there's actually 20 different question types, there's lots of configurations, we'll start adapting now. But that very much depends on resources, your students, the institution that you're in. There are so many different factors. So I think it's an evolution over a period of time as to how people will use the gamut of tools available to them.
And to that point, I was wondering, what appetite have you seen for more AI and automation, and using that as a potential solution to help universities scale, increase the sort of the randomization and therefore the fairness that you were talking about, and also just I suppose it's a way of just being able to be transparent with students about the type of assessment that they are receiving as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Soft AI, which is not actually AI, it's institutions using some of the tools out there that is effectively just computer matching. So yes, we've seen an increase rather in the number of institutions using things like our automatic text and number type questions, where essentially you have a box, you tell the platform what the answers are, and it will just do a simple match against the answers that you put in, with your ability to then manually intervene if you want to. So there's a little bit of that. On the sort of broader bit of AI, yeah, we don't do it at the moment, and I think it's something we're exploring because we actually want AI to be used in the way that it should be. I wouldn't, for example, believe in AI marking an entire essay, and I think importantly, if people attending today think that proctoring is something that is contentious with students, I am pretty sure that students would be quite miffed if they found out that a computer was marking their essay. On the contrary, though, if AI is used as it should be, which is to assist the human beings involved by flagging parts of essays, by assisting that marker in doing some of the more routine things that they do to shift some of the burden away so that the time that they are given by the institution to mark each paper can be used even better, that is what we believe in, certainly what I believe in and what we will look to do. So the ability to say, okay, well, I want to, I'd like the system to flag words. I'd like the system to flag phrases so I can see them and they jump out of the page a little bit better to me while I mark. So that is the kind of AI that I think that not only us, but other platforms will spend time developing and looking into to assist, but not the replacement of the grader, because ultimately that's what they're good at and that's what the student wants.
Okay, thank you very much. To that point, Deborah and Patrice, this is a slight aside, but do you see attitudes towards AI changing among staff and students, and do you think this will have a knock-on effect for assessment? I mean, I think everyone's heard the example of the chatbot that has improved students' lives by being able to answer fairly rote questions at 2 a.m. the night before if they can't remember where they're supposed to be for their seminar in the morning. And also that reducing a lot of workload and repetition amongst administrators at universities. Obviously, as Ishan described, it's a lot more complex when you're talking about something that's as high stakes as an examination and assessment. But do you think there are any signs that there is a wind change regarding people's attitude to AI for that?
I mean, I'll start off first of all with that one. I think that as someone who did a master's in computers and law, crikey, something like 30 years ago, there has been a massive sea change in the use of computers. What I tend to find though is that they always say, "Oh, it's just around the corner, it's happening tomorrow," and actually, it's probably 10 years up the road. There is, as Ishan's has pointed out, a big difference in what AI is and what people call AI. But I do feel that AI will help students significantly when it comes to their learning, and as a way for them to be able to find out answers to things that they would possibly otherwise ask one of their tutors as well. It's very, very difficult, I think, because you may well find that at some point in the future, some of the academics' jobs may well be slightly at risk at some point, because there are different ways of individuals learning what they actually need to learn. And I think it's about making sure that us as leaders, teachers, academics in the HE sector are doing things that other people and other things probably cannot, and whether that is teaching true critical thinking and various other ways of getting a degree, then that may well be something that is worthwhile thinking about. Just to whiz back though very quickly, I don't want to change the direction of the question.
Oh, no. Perfect.
When it comes to AI and multiple choice, there's been a few questions in there about MCQs. It's interesting when you get to multiple choice questions, sometimes actually the computer analysis that follows on from a multiple choice answer set is actually quite helpful. So you may find that 50% of the students may get what you think is the right answer, but then 40% of the students, and that shows up when you look at the statistics, 40% get the wrong answer. And then you've got to look back at, why did they get the wrong answer? Why did so many people choose that particular question, and it may be that they've seen something in the question that you did not. It may be the question was slightly ambiguous, or it may well highlight some deficiencies in the teaching for a particular subset of those students. So it is about, it's not a be all and end all. So using a multiple choice thing isn't about just taking the assessment burden and just completely shifting it. There is always going to be some analysis of the data that's required. But when it comes to the use of multiple choice generally, it's a really, really good way to test knowledge and pure knowledge. I don't think it's always the best way of testing the critical application of that knowledge, but it can be done if the question is appropriately written. And to use a bit of knowledge that someone gave me some time ago, if everybody if multiple choice questions were so easy, everybody would win £1 million on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. So I'll leave it at that. But
that's
Alistair,
my line that you've stolen, but there we
it
are.
is.
Patrick, if you could perhaps tell us about your thoughts about this. I mean, bearing in mind that you're an institution with quite a niche cohort, and perhaps are not dealing with the same diversity and access issues that among cohorts that other universities are.
So we had Sir Geoffrey Voss, the Master of the Rolls, come to talk to our students a week and a half ago. And he is a great advocate and disciple for the use of AI in the practice of law. Leave aside the academic teaching of law for a second. And this, I think, is something that makes practitioners deeply nervous, the idea that their job might suddenly disappear to be done by a robot. And I think, having listened to Sir Geoffrey Voss for an hour and a half on the subject, that's not coming. At least it's not coming in the next 5, 10, 20 years. Where AI is going to impact in the practice of law and in the conduct of litigation is going to be in those kind of areas that Ish and Dev were hinting at. It's going to be the arrival of the chatbot, so that if you're conducting your own case and you're going through the online case system, something pops up to say, have you remembered to do your disclosure statement? And here's a link to the disclosure statement of things you need to include in it. It's going to be taking the routine and the mundane things out of a process and automating them and giving people assistance that doesn't require a human being to sit down with them and say, now, have you done this, this, and this? Where AI is not at the moment, it seems to me, is in the making of judgments that require experience of the world and of a particular subject expertise. There's just no way that you could say to a computer at the moment, tell me the difference between a contract law essay at 65 and a contract law essay at 75. That decision still absolutely has to rest in the hands of an academic, in the same way that a decision about whether it's in the best interest of a client to accept an offer for £25,000 in a personal injury case or £50,000 in a personal injury case is absolutely in the hands of the practitioners or the judges, and will remain so for a considerable period of time. So I think if we can take away people's fear that the arrival of AI means you won't have a job, but what we're going to do is bring in a computer to do your job and dispense with academics or with markers or with judges or with lawyers. And if we can say to people, it's about taking the things that don't require that level of expertise and don't require your ability to critically think and all your experience that you bring to the job of marking or conducting a case in the courts or deciding a case in the courts, then it becomes, it seems to me, if it can be taken in that context, we can start to allay people's fears. And where AI is genuinely useful and genuinely works, it can become, as is said, an assistance to the task rather than a replacement of the person doing the task.
Great, thank you very much. I'm just going to try and get through a couple more questions in the 7 minutes we have left for the hour. Ishan, there's been one question about how certain arts and humanities courses, or I guess this does apply to STEM courses as well, that have a strong practical element. So I guess that's everything from art and design to engineering, really. Students do those subjects because they want the practical element, and it is something that is applicable to the work that they will do after university. Are there any examples you've seen that you think have handled that, where you think people have handled that very well over the past 18 months or so?
I think the ones that have are the ones that lend themselves to actually not explain this very well. So yes, and it's actually in the context we've been talking about today. So for example, oral exams are something that you can digitize, but someone's ability to do to create a piece of art. My lack of artistic ability is coming through here. But to paint something, yes, absolutely, you wouldn't want them doing that digitally. What you might, however, want to do is to allow them to do that in the way that they ordinarily would, but then use the digital tools to help you elsewhere in the process. So, for example, if you then wanted to have your second marker, your moderator, your external examiner, who are nowhere near you, you could use your digital tools to take a photograph of that or to video that, and then use the digital aspect to assist with the marking process and its administration. So there are absolutely some areas where the student aspect of it can't be digital. It just doesn't lend itself to the format. But that doesn't stop you thinking about the entirety of it. I think this sort of folds back into the way of thinking that we can all be prone to in every area, just forgetting digital assessment or education or anything, which is when we have a system, we bemoan its deficiencies. When we move to something new, we almost, there's a chance we can fetishize what came before. This was great, and we forget about all the things that didn't work. The new one will have things that don't work in the same way too. So it's a question of, well, what really did work? What did we do because we had to? What do we do because it was just so particular and peculiar to paper? How do we amend it now? And I'm certainly not suggesting that the tail wags the dog and you say, well, I must do things differently. You don't. But it's a chance to go back to basics and say, what are we actually trying to do? Now let's map it out. We'll have some pros and cons on both sides, and we make a value judgment then as to what we are going to pick. Nothing will be perfect and nothing will look identical to one another. So which one overall gives us the student experience that we want, the administrative experience we want, and the overall process that actually benefits everyone involved?
Great, thank you very much. I've got one final question, which we could probably discuss for an hour, but we've got 4 minutes. So I apologise to the panel in advance for dropping this on you so late in the proceedings. But we've had a couple of questions about how much teaching and assessment in this case can be used to reflect labour market values and skill shortages. This is something that is constantly in the news and seems like an increasing pressure on universities that just grows as people become more aware of skill shortages that exist and also how skills requirements are changing in order to keep up with modern jobs. So I would like to ask the panel, how much are they considering a skills agenda or skill shortages when they are looking at the skills that they are embedding to a discipline such as law, which, as we all know, can be applied for not just many different disciplines and types of law, but many different ways. Is this something that's becoming increasingly important? Have you taken steps to address it so far?
I'm happy to jump in. First of all, Matt, just because when we're talking about skills is the whole of the second part of our course. The first part is knowledge, and that's assessed the way we've described. And the second part is skills. So one of the things that happened with the pandemic is that in the initial weeks and months, the courts completely shut, and then they began to reopen, and the majority of hearings became online. Advocates who had up and down the country been appearing in courts day after day after day were suddenly faced with the need to be able to conduct a hearing remotely and as effectively as they would have been able to do face to face. And the ICCA's response to that, because we have obligations not just to the students but also to the profession, was to kick into gear and to provide as best we could guides for advocates as to how to conduct online advocacy effectively. We ran a scheme for second six pupil barristers who were about to start on their feet when the pandemic hit, and so we're about to start going to court. And we said, fine, we'll start remote training for you, and we had that up and running within about 3 or 4 weeks. The question for us, it seems to me, and I'll finish with this, in the next kind of 6, 12, 18 months is, given that just like assessment's probably not going back to where it was in March 2020, the courts aren't going back to where they were in March 2020, online hearings will continue. How do we now adjust our teaching and assessment to match the fact that advocates in 2025, 2030 will have to do a blend of online advocacy and face-to-face advocacy? And how do we, in the course of our teaching and assessment, train them as effectively as we can to be able to do that? And it seems to me that's a question that's going to occupy us over the course of the next 5-10 years.
Okay. Deborah, is this putting a renewed focus on soft skills such as communication, leadership, teamwork, critical thinking?
I don't think it's a new focus. I think it's a focus that's been there for an awful long time. I think that as an HE provider where I work, it's about preparing individuals for what are likely to be portfolio careers, where they come out with a degree and they think that they're going to be doing this particular job for their life, but actually the chances are that they probably won't. So for me, it's about making sure that we're able to embed skills into the curriculum to make sure that when students do graduate, that they can use, it's transferable. So a presentation is just as good. It's for advocacy, for example. It's a form of that. It's public speaking. And it's about trying to give students the confidence also to just try things new and take one thing and then place it somewhere else. Because at the end of it, many of the things that we teach in HE are equally transferable elsewhere. But digital literacy is something that I think we do need to push an awful lot more.
Okay, that can be our next hour that we do together then, hopefully. Thank you all very much for joining us today. That takes us up to time. To answer a couple of other questions about the delivery of this session, yes, there will be an on-demand video capture of this recording available on the THE website. It will also be placed alongside a summary article of the key findings and takeaways, and we will email that to everyone who has registered and been in attendance today. You are more than welcome to revisit the content and share it as you see fit. We hope you find that useful. I would also like to thank all of our panel for joining us and giving us such a huge amount of knowledge in what seemed like a very short hour. So thank you to Ishan, Deborah and Patrick for being here today. And yes, thank you all for joining us. We hope you'll stay safe over the holiday period. We hope you've enjoyed this webinar, and we hope to be able to engage with you at future THE events. So thank you all very much. Merry Christmas and goodbye.